I have a bit of a weird relationship with Megaman in that for a long time, despite being into and around so many adjacent things to the Blue Bomber, I never really had much of a history with him whatsoever. In fact, until a few years ago, the only real exposure I had to him outside of YouTube videos was a Megaman X3 demo disc that I remember not liking as much as Metal Slug 3, and also various fighting game cameos such as Smash Bros and the unadulterated classic that is Onimusha Blade Warriors. What's funny is that when I was a kid, Tron Bonne was one of my mains in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 whenever I'd play it with my brother, but it wasn't until my 20s when I finally found out what she was actually from. This is something I've tried to rectify over the years. I gave the Wily Wars a go back when I was in college, but ended up bouncing off it pretty hard, and most of my other attempts to play the series were inevitably cut short due to the fun of emulation pulling my attention in every direction. But luckily, thanks to the Legacy collections, I did eventually get the chance to properly sit down and play through the first 4 Mega Man X games, and ended up enjoying them quite a bit. They had just that tiny little bit more edge compared to the original games that I'll always buy into, and between dashing and wall jumping, the movement felt just involved enough for me not to bounce off of it. More importantly, however, the X games had Zero in them, and I don't know about you, but this guy is just infinitely more cool than X because he just has so much sauce to him. Realistically, I need to give the Mega Man Zero games a proper try because obviously they sound right up my alley, but for now I want to take some time to talk about the game that Zero was first playable in, Mega Man X3. A game that, despite having quite a few problems, I'm very fond of, partly due to my obvious bias towards Zero, but because of many other reasons as well. Mega Man X3 is pretty easily considered the black sheep of the SNES trilogy of the X games, and for good reason. But I feel like most of its problems are actually caused by flawed ambition rather than it just being bad. Luckily, thanks to the modern age, we can now enjoy it in such a way that helps it reach its full potential, and that's via a wonderful fan-made work known as the Zero Project. So welcome gamers to the recently renamed LATEnt Potential, a series where we showcase and review fan-made mods, patches and remakes of games both good and bad to see just how much we can fix and or improve upon them. And funnily enough, finding out about the Zero Project was actually one of the initial sparks that caused the inception of this series to begin with, so I'm glad that we're finally getting round to it, since I feel like what it does for X3 is truly transformative. Because while it does do what the name suggests and better incorporate Zero into the game, it also achieves so much more by trying to address the fundamental underlying problems that X3 possesses. Before we can fully go into detail as to what the mod does, however, I should start by giving a rundown of what the deal with Mega Man X3 actually is and what common complaints people have with the game are. For starters, something that you might not know is that X3 was not actually developed by the core Mega Man team that worked internally at Capcom, since they had already started development on a Mega Man X game for the PlayStation 1, which would go on to be Mega Man X4. But thanks to Capcom being Capcom at the time, they loved squeezing just about as much blood as they could from their code and art assets, and for good reason as well. So while the core team spent time on X4, the development of X3 was outsourced to a relatively small development studio called Minakuchi Engineering. These guys were founded in the 80s and had worked as guns for hire on a lot of different projects, usually working as extra manpower to assist bigger studios, and would often go uncredited for a lot of their work. They did, however, establish a bit of a working relationship with Capcom, making ports of their already existing games like the SNES port of the Knights of the Round arcade game. But what they're probably most well known for is creating the majority of the Mega Man ports for the original Game Boy, as well as, ironically enough for me, the Wily Wars for the Sega Genesis. And since Capcom wanted a team to handle a new, lower budget Mega Man X game while they spent time on the fancy next-gen sequel, it seemed like with all of their experience porting the original series, Minakuchi Engineering were the perfect fit. If anybody had to take the reins of making a new sequel, it might as well be the team that at least has some experience with the series. And I imagine the thought process was that, at the end of the day, this is a new Mega Man game, a series built built on a pretty strict formula. As far as developing a new game goes, it should be relatively easy. Paint by numbers level shit. It seems, however, that the folks at Minakuchi were not satisfied with just doing the bare minimum, and I suppose that does make sense. This was basically their chance to work on a full game and really prove themselves. And while X3 definitely is a more of the same style sequel, they actually ended up adding quite a bit of new to it as well. Retaining all of the old staples from the previous games, such as the usual sub-weapons, heart tanks and light capsules, but also adding a whole host of other upgrades and tools to assist you too. They even went as far to add an equivalent to the X2 gimmick of the X-Hunters in the form of Bit, Bite and Vial, just so they could definitively say that there was nothing that the previous games had that this game didn't. But this is actually where the first problem begins to arise, and that's that all of this new stuff was not exactly the most well thought out, and a lot of the new content is either somewhat underwhelming or actively bloats certain parts of the game, interrupting the usual rhythm that you'd expect from a normal Mega Man playthrough. See, Mega Man historically has always had a very particular ebb and flow to how you progress through its levels. Each boss having a weakness to a particular weapon that you get from another boss means that while some of them can be quite hard, if you can take down at least one of the easier ones, you can then join the weapon weakness cycle and trivialize the rest. This is how the Mega Man series has been able to retain its reputation as a pretty famously difficult action platformer, whilst also still being approachable to players of a lesser skill level. But more importantly, it's also what makes this series so damn replayable, especially when we take into account the different upgrades and collectibles from the X series. While you could just take on an easy boss and start churning through the sub-weapon weakness order, if you do this, you're more than likely going to need to backtrack and replay a bossless level or two, since there's quite a few different collectibles that are locked behind having a sub-weapon or upgrade already acquired. And this is perfectly fine for a first playthrough when you're still learning the ropes and having to actively hunt down various secrets, but when you already know where all the collectibles are, naturally you'll want any repeat playthrough to be a bit more efficient. And so the natural course of action is to make these little difficult sacrifices to keep things interesting. The arcadey nature of the game already lends itself to doing various different challenges like a X-Buster only run and trying to beat the game as quick as possible. But by breaking free of the weapon weakness order to reduce or even eliminate all of the backtracking you eventually have to do, the game is actively encouraging you to try and take on these slight extra bits of challenges to not only make you play more efficiently, but also to make you engage with bosses' actual mechanics and attack patterns. And it's this style of replayable arcade-like structure that has not only made Mega Man so successful, but is also the secret source of many of Capcom's popular series, and is part of the reason as to how they've managed to rival even Nintendo in terms of the number of different resonant IPs that they've created. But this is where X3 ends up throwing a bit of a spanner into the works. The new collectibles, such as the new enhancement chips and the ride armors that can be summoned from select stations, are cool ideas in theory, but unfortunately Minakuchi decided to not only lock these upgrades behind getting other upgrades first, but also locked using them behind upgrades too. For example, you can get the arm enhancement chip from Gravity Beetle's stage, but to do so you're going to need to use one of the ride armors. This is already made worse by the fact that you need to use the Chimera armor before you can use any of the robot ride armors at all, but then this is made even worse by the fact that you can't get the Buster enhancement chip until you've got the Buster armor upgrade to begin with. So what ends up happening is you have the ride armors, an upgrade that you can only use once you've got a specific one of the 4 available, and the enhancement chips that can only be acquired after you've got certain other upgrades too. And this is on top of the already existing requirements to get to them in the first place. And what this means is that so many of the different collectibles in this game just have that extra layer of obfuscation that ends up frustrating the player even more trying to get to them. It's potentially a good idea in moderation for a bigger game with more stuff going on, as it forces you to make certain decisions with your routing. But the Mega Man X games had already met a happy medium in this regard, so it ends up just restricting the player more than than it adds to the complexity of planning out your route. And this heavy limiting creates a scenario where backtracking ends up being practically forced. Even with the most efficient route, you're still going to have to replay certain stages over and over, and that's very antithetical to the design of Mega Man as a whole. And the thing is, some of these problems are very easily fixed, because stuff like the ride armor limitations are very artificial in their nature. The reason why you need the Chimera armor first does make thematical sense, since the implication is that the Chimera armor is the base version of the mech suit, and all of the others are modules that you plug in and install to upgrade and modify it. Like, it's this nice little bit of extra world building, I suppose, but it's not really worth making the game worse because of it. There's multiple collectibles that you can only get thanks to using the ride armors. And you can only use ride armors if you can get this particular one, and you can only get this particular one if you get Tornado Fang from Tunnel Rhino's stage and bring it to Blast Hornets. Mega Man X1 kinda did the same thing with the leg parts, since that's very essential for getting through that game, but that's a mandatory thing that you have to pick up on the crit path, and is also there to kind of introduce you to the fact of armor upgrades to begin with. Meanwhile in X3, while the Tornado Fang sub-weapon is certainly mandatory, the ride armor that you get with it isn't, and you end up funneling so much of the game's upgrades through this very specific bottleneck. As for the enhancement chips, I actually think these are pretty cool. There's 4 of them in the game, each one of them correlating to each one of your upgrades that you get for your head, body, legs and arms, and getting one will further upgrade that particular part of the third armor, be it increasing your defense even more, giving you an extra air dash, slowly healing you when standing still, or giving you the ability to fire off charge shots without charging. The catch to these is that you could only equip one at a time, and at least in the SNES release, you're locked to whatever one you find first unless you reload your save. Now, on a personal level, I really quite like this, because it means that every playthrough of X3 is just that little bit more personalized. But it is really disappointing on a first playthrough finding one of these pink light capsules and having that little hit of dopamine instantly taken away from you as soon as you realize that it's useless because you already have one or you don't have the armor piece to equip it yet. The other problem is that the whole system ends up being kind of invalidated by the existence of the hyperchip, or the secret gold armor upgrade. This can only be acquired in the final gauntlet of the game, but only if you haven't picked up any of the other chips. I like this idea in theory, as it's a sort of risk versus reward ordeal, where putting off getting one of the upgrades and toughing it out until later in the game means that you can get all of them instead of just one. But what this ends up doing is that if you're going for the hyperchip and gold armor, it means that all 4 of these pink light capsules are now just completely useless. And now you get that disappointing feeling after finding all of them. Now, I do get that the gold armor is supposed to be this sort of secret upgrade a la the Hadouken in the first game, but it does feel like first-time players are punished for actively exploring and being curious because of it. Another key problem with X3 is that the levels and bosses are honestly a little bit basic and simple compared to the first 2 games. And to compensate for this, the devs decided to have enemies hit you like an absolute sledgehammer to offset the otherwise pretty easy to deal with level design. Artificial difficulty problems aside, a weird quirk of this is that for some reason, contact damage in particular is what they raise the most. So much so in fact that in various situations you actually end up taking more damage from bumping shoulders with a boss than you do actually getting hit from their various laser beams or claw swipes or whatever. It seems really ass backwards that getting hit by an actual attack will do less damage to you than stubbing your toe on their head when you try and jump over them. And it just doesn't feel good at all. It's very anti-intuitive. Now, the level design being the way that it is could easily be attributed to the devs not being that original team to work on Mega Man, and I think that probably is the core reason, but there is something that I think should be stated, and that's that it's also very, very clear that this game just doesn't have quite the same budget that 1 and 2 had. It's heavily relying on asset reuse to even exist, and when you compare it to X2, I think it becomes the most clear that yeah, this game isn't really getting the same level of money and juice poured into it. And nothing illustrates this better than the bosses of X2's and X3's opening levels, both of which are giant robots. In X2, this fight is a pretty big spectacle as the boss fills up multiple screens in this huge arena and is very cleverly animated in this way to create a fairly decent 3D effect. And there's no denying that this is a great way of starting off the game, even if it's over within a couple of seconds. And then we can even compare this to X3's opening stage boss, another giant robot complete with spiky ball hands on chains, except this one doesn't animate at all nearly. It exists primarily as a background element in a already pretty flat stage. It does have a mildly destructible arena, I suppose, but it doesn't exactly invoke that same sort of wow factor that the X2 boss does. And it becomes increasingly clear, at least to me, that whatever the devs were working with was not the same as what the core team had on hand with the previous 2 games. And I feel like this is why they chose to expand the game in the ways that they did with things like ride armors, enhancement chips, and Zero, because all of them either reused assets or barely used any new ones at all. And speaking of Zero, he's probably the most disappointing aspect of this game, since while he is technically playable, it's done in such a limited capacity that he's honestly barely worth mentioning as a feature unless you're working as part of the marketing team. Luckily, Zero doesn't hinder the game in any way like some of the other additions, but he is the most exciting of them, so it's the most disappointing when he's kind of half-arsed. He's essentially just a mildly better version of X, with a slightly bigger health bar and the double charge shot from X2 at the beginning of the game, with a 4th tier of charge level that allows you to use his incredibly powerful Z-Saber swing that does a ton of damage. Problem is that there's nothing in the game to bloody use it on. See, while Zero is playable, he's not really a second character or anything, he's somebody that you call in temporarily whilst playing the game as X like usual. He can't get sub-weapons, armor upgrades, heart tanks or anything, and he'll automatically switch out back to X whenever you reach a boss or mini-boss room, meaning his one unique trait barely ever gets a chance to even be useful. Even his bigger health bar becomes redundant after you pick up just a couple of heart tanks with X. The problem isn't even that he feels kinda half-baked being very similar to X, but is instead that his inclusion comes with so many drawbacks and caveats, it's honestly a struggle to see the point of even really using him. Especially when, if he does happen to die when you are using him, he's permanently gone for the rest of your playthrough. However, there is a weird exception to one of the rules of using Zero in this game, and that's to unlock his Z-Saber as a final secret upgrade to X. This being this game's actual version of the crazy OP boss killer weapon, with it doing even more damage than Zero's typical Z-Saber swing and having a projectile added to it. And to unlock it, it requires you to take Zero into this very specific mini-boss room and taking out the boss, despite the fact that up until this point, the game has been teaching you that Zero can't fight bosses. And it ends up being an even more bizarre and obtuse secret than even the hyper chip and gold armor. Everything else that's wrong with this game that hinders it from being up there with X1 and X2 is pretty understandable. They're all mistakes or oversights from a less experienced team with a smaller budget. But this shit with Zero is honestly just baffling. I don't know why it's the way that it is at all. Luckily, this is where the Zero project comes into play. Now, it has had a few different iterations and reworks over the years, but the core mission statement of this patch has always remained very clear. Make Zero's inclusion in X3 more substantial and more worthwhile. But if it was just that, then this video would be pretty short and arguably not really worth making. Fortunately enough for me, it goes so much further than that, smoothing down all of X3's different problem areas and making a version of the game where all of that wasted ambition can actually shine the way that it's supposed to. Many of X3's underlying problems cannot be fixed, not truly at least, but the Zero project at least takes strides to remedy them as much as it can instead. Firstly though, let's talk about the main attraction being Zero himself. You can now freely switch between Zero and X at pretty much any point during any mission. Zero is also now a fully complete character, with his main deal being that his core moveset and stats are better than X's, but he's a lot less versatile. He can now collect every single one of the game's upgrades, be it heart tanks, sub-tanks, ride armor chips or capsules, with the latter being ones that he can't actually use but he can acquire for X. Other than his Z-Saber, which is his main gimmick, he still retains things like his slightly longer health bar, which is there to offset the fact that his sprite is a little bit bigger than Mega Man's and therefore has a little bit of a bigger hitbox too. He's also just a little bit more agile than X, with him starting out with an air dash but also a double jump, not an upwards air dash but a actual double jump. This honestly makes him very responsive and really offsets the fact that he's got a bigger hitbox in my opinion. All of this comes at the cost, however, that Zero's sub-weapons use twice as much ammo to be used, and also he doesn't get any sort of upgrades from light capsules throughout the game. However, getting the hyper chip to get the gold armor for X also unlocks the black armor for Zero, and getting the black armor for Zero basically just leans him even further into that core moveset idea. His defense is doubled, his Z-Saber does slightly more damage, his dashes go slightly further, and he gets an overall speed increase. And his sub-weapon ammo consumption is set to its normal value, so it's still not outpacing X's, but it's not anywhere near as bad as it was normally. Something else that you'll also discover thanks to the game's new save and new game plus features is that after getting the Z-Saber for X, it means that on repeat playthroughs, Zero's Z-Saber will also be upgraded and have that projectile and overall damage boost as well. Admittedly, going through the game like this is pretty boring, but it is fun to do a victory lap playthrough after you've done everything else. The save feature is also really well implemented. It's got a really nice layout that shows you every single different upgrade that you have on any given save file, and you can have multiple save files on the go, meaning that you can still replay the game from scratch without having to sacrifice that new game plus playthrough with everything already unlocked. And something else that's pretty cool, even if the changes are relatively minor, is that going through the game as Zero does change the dialogue a bit for various cutscenes. For the most part, it's not that different, but taking on Dr. Doppler, Sigma, and Vile as Zero is pretty neat. And finally, Zero's Z-Saber has been given the ability to destroy parts of the scenery that would otherwise need certain sub-weapons to gain access to. Now, this does kind of invalidate using the sub-weapons to get to these places to begin with, but considering X3's already pretty closed off item game, I think it's a worthy trade-off. And speaking of an improved item game, two things that should be mentioned is that ride armors can now be acquired in any order that you please, so that old problem is no longer an issue. The other thing is that while acquiring the hyper chip and gold armor is still possible by not getting any of the other enhancement chips, you can also get it by getting all of them. This means that the risk versus reward element of the original vanilla game is still intact, but it no longer punishes players for being completionists either. Between all of these major changes, as well as a few little tweaks here and there throughout the rest of the game, this majorly improves the different routing potential that you have for going through X3. Backtracking is now significantly less emphasized, and you can actually enjoy playing the game in a variety of different ways. However, the final thing that the Zero project addresses is the game's balancing, with the biggest change being reverting the collision damage, particularly from bosses, back to a more reasonable amount. Now, doing this without changing the level design, which is honestly very much outside of the scope of this mod, does end up making the game pretty damn easy, especially when you consider that being able to fully switch between two different characters with their own independent health bars in any given level does basically mean you have double health now. And when you pair it with the reduced damage from enemies, you do start to really see the cracks in this game's level design. It really is kind of basic and easy, but at the end of the day, I'd rather have a slightly easy Mega Man game than a really goddamn frustrating one. And at the end of the day, you can always just tell yourself not to switch characters. It's the same as an X-Buster only run. But with that, that's pretty much just about everything. There are more things to the mod to be sure, but the rest of them are tiny little quality of life tweaks and fixes. Stuff like the healing from the enhanced head armor upgrade now gradually increases how much it heals by each tick, greatly reducing how much time it takes standing still for it to fill all the way back up. It's by no means needed, but it is a nice little addition to just help smooth out some of those other edges still available. And that kind of describes what the Zero project is. Megaman X3 isn't this terrible, unfinished mess of a game like Megaman X7 or DMC2. As I said at the beginning of the video, a lot of its problems are less that it's badly made and more that it just has flawed ambition. And it's partly why I didn't call this video Can We Fix Megaman X3, because realistically, there's not much that needs fixing, and the Zero project only really mildly addresses the quote-unquote bad parts of X3. Its main focus is less about making the bad parts less worse, and more about making the good parts really shine as much as they're supposed to. There's a reason why the Zero project was one of the main inspirations for this series. It's a perfect example of a game finally reaching its latent potential.